It all started when Jacob received the invitation. It came in the mail one unassuming Wednesday afternoon, as most invitations do, tucked inside a weathered envelope, with his name scrawled across the front in a hasty, unfamiliar handwriting. The stamp was old-fashioned, with no discernible return address, yet the stamp was perfectly intact, sealed with care. He opened it without thinking much about it. Inside there was a single piece of paper, also handwritten. Come to the old house on Main Street. Midnight. Don't be late. Jacob stared at the note for a long time. The words were strange. There was an urgency to them, something almost desperate in the way they were written. But who would send him something like this? He didn't recognize the handwriting. He didn't even know anyone who lived near Main Street. For a moment, Jacob considered discarding the letter, chalking it up to some prank or misunderstanding. He had a long history of being skeptical, of dismissing things as coincidences. After all, what were the odds that something like this could be real? But the longer he stared at the note, the more something gnawed at him, an unfamiliar curiosity pushing him to take action. What could it hurt to go? As midnight approached, Jacob found himself standing on the edge of the property. The house stood there in front of him, towering and ominous, as though it had been waiting for him for a long time. The windows were dark, the front door slightly ajar as if someone had been expecting him. The wind whispered through the trees surrounding the house, carrying with it a chill that made his skin crawl. It was an old house, built at least a century ago. The paint was peeling, the shingles falling apart in places. The yard was overgrown, and the whole property had an eerie, decaying quality to it, like it had been abandoned for years. Yet, despite the neglect, there was something strangely compelling about it. Jacob hesitated at the gate, feeling the weight of his decision sink into his chest. He could still turn back, but something inside him urged him forward. He had to know what awaited him inside that house. He pushed open the gate and stepped onto the cobblestone path that led to the door. The wind howled louder now, almost as if trying to warn him to leave. But the door was open, beckoning him inside. With one final breath, Jacob stepped across the threshold. The door slammed shut behind him. Inside, the house was much worse than he had anticipated. The air was thick with dust, and the walls were covered in strange, faded tapestries that seemed to move when he wasn't looking. A strange, pungent odor hung in the air, a mixture of mold and something else, something far more sinister. As Jacob moved through the house, he noticed odd things. Portraits on the walls, distorted faces that seemed to follow him wherever he went. The furniture was old and worn, but it was clear someone had been living there recently. It was as if the house was stuck in time, a moment frozen, waiting for something to happen. In the hallway, Jacob found a door at the end that was slightly ajar. Without thinking, he pushed it open, his heartbeat quickening. Inside, a large, dusty mirror hung on the wall. But as he gazed at his reflection, his heart skipped a beat. The reflection in the mirror wasn't his own. It was someone else's, someone unfamiliar. A woman standing just behind him, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow. Jacob spun around, but there was no one there. The room was empty, save for the eerie, cracked mirror. He took a step backward, his breath catching in his throat. What the hell was happening? Suddenly he heard a sound, a soft creaking noise coming from upstairs. It was followed by the sound of footsteps. Jacob froze. He wasn't alone. Someone else was here with him. As Jacob ascended the stairs, each step seemed to echo in the empty silence of the house. The footsteps above him continued, as if the person or thing was waiting for him. He reached the top of the staircase and found himself in a long hallway, its walls lined with more unsettling portraits. At the far end of the hall, a door stood slightly open, the faint glow of candlelight flickering from within. The footsteps stopped. Jacob's heart pounded in his chest as he approached the door, his breath coming in short gasps. His hand reached for the door handle, but before he could touch it, a voice echoed from behind him. "Don't go in there." Jacob spun around to find a man standing at the end of the hallway. He was tall, gaunt, with hollow eyes that stared at Jacob with an unsettling intensity. His clothes were old, outdated, like he had stepped out of another time entirely. "Who are you?" Jacob demanded, his voice shaky. The man didn't answer. Instead, he stepped forward, his gaze never leaving Jacob. "You shouldn't be here. None of us should be." Jacob took a step back, his mind racing. "What is this place? What do you want from me?" The man's expression darkened. "The house. It's not what it seems. It doesn't want you to leave. None of us have ever left." Jacob's heart sank. "What do you mean? What happens to people who come here?" The man opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, the door behind him slammed open. A gust of wind rushed through the hallway, extinguishing the candlelight and plunging them into darkness. The man's eyes widened in fear as he turned to face the now empty room. "They've come for you," he whispered. "Get out." "It's too late for me. But you can still escape." Before Jacob could ask what he meant, the man dissolved into thin air, vanishing as though he had never existed. Panic surged through Jacob. He didn't know who or what he had just encountered, but there was no time to think. Something was coming, something that wanted him to stay. He bolted for the stairs, but as he reached the bottom, the door slammed shut once again. The house had trapped him inside. Jacob's heart raced as he tried every door in the house, each one locked tight. He pounded on the windows, but there was no escape. The house had him, and there was nothing he could do to break free. As the hours passed, the house seemed to close in on him, its walls narrowing, its holes stretching impossibly far. Strange whispers filled the air, voices that seemed to come from all directions. Then, in the middle of the night, the lights flickered, and the house seemed to come alive. The air grew colder, and the walls began to bleed, dark red stains dripping from the ceiling. Jacob screamed, but his voice was swallowed by the darkness. And that was the last sound anyone heard from him. The next morning, the house stood empty once more. The invitation was gone. The mirror was shattered. And the only thing that remained were the whispers, still echoing in the night.